647. House of the Colonel. The history of Ethiopia is not found in the decrees of her kings, nor in the ink of her treaties, but in the marrow of her families. It is a history written in the quiet discipline of men who refuse to be broken by the shifting winds of politics. To tell the story of the boy, Nahum, one must first tell the story of the fortress that forged him. One must tell the story of 647, a house numbered by the municipality, but named by the Spirit. And the memory of 647 begins not with the sight of its stone, but with the sound of a voice like a trumpet heard across a valley of mist. Colonel Teferidin Yitna spoke little, for he knew that words, like ammunition, must never be squandered. He moved through the world with a gravity earned in the biting dust of the Ogaden, in the hallowed halls of the old police college, and along the long, unbending corridors of duty that stretched from the solar glory of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I to the blood-dimmed dawn of the Derg. Long before the epaulets of a full colonel rested upon his shoulders, before the command of cities, before the iron gates of Kazanchis, he was a child of the high, thin air, born in Shenkora, a small town in Minjar, where the southern edge of northern Shewa meets the sky. His early years were defined by the rhythm of the flock and the vast, open silence of the Ethiopian countryside. As a shepherd, he learned the first lesson of leadership, that the shepherd exists for the flock, not the flock for the shepherd. The legend, engraved in the hearts of his kin, tells that he once saw the emperor passing through the emerald countryside and, possessed by a holy boldness, fell to his knees to beg for the only weapon he desired, an education. The King of Kings, who spent a lifetime cultivating the minds of his people and never forgot the courage of the young, possessed a mystical eye for the spark of character and saw a pillar in the shepherd. He ordered him to the halls of learning, and from that moment the shepherd of Shenkora became a student of the empire. That single gesture of imperial grace shaped a dynasty. At Kedemawi, Haile Selassie I's school, the boy who once counted sheep began to count the stars of logic, mathematics, and foreign tongues. But his true tempering occurred at the Aberdeen Police College. Founded in 1946 and staffed by Swedish instructors, Aberdeen was the furnace where the modern Ethiopian officer was forged, and Teferidin became a master of criminology and discipline. He graduated among the very first officers to be trained in the scientific method of investigation. Yet for all his modern training, he remained a man of the old world, a man who believed that the law was a sacred liturgy. Law to him was not a weapon of the strong, but a shield for the weak. He was a man of exact lines, a carpenter of justice. Those who served with him saw a man of iron whose clock was the sun and whose word was a covenant, never late, never corrupt. A man whose spine was a plumb line that could not be bent even to save his own flesh. In the taverns of Addis, where the common man writes the psalms of the city, where the truth is sung when it cannot be spoken, his name became a holy refrain. Wubi Bareha Mehal Yimetal Begena, Arat Kilo Mehal Yimetal Begena, Ahunim Kedimim Teferidin Yitna.
I was raised in Kazanchis, in the house of the colonel. where the shepherd's prayer became the soldier's vow. I was raised in 647, in the sanctuary of the unbending, where the emperor's nod became a dynasty's brow. Between the dust of Minjar and the gates of the palace, I was raised where the truth is the only chalice.
A man of such iron discipline required a partner of equal spirit. He found her in Wasan Demisi, the daughter of Balambaras Demisi Maru, a judge of immense reputation who presided over the hills of St. Michael. Their meeting was the meeting of law and loyalty, the judicial mountain and the military city. To join their hands was to join the law of the court with the loyalty of the uniform. Wasan was not merely a wife, she was the architect of the home's soul. She brought a grace that could soften the colonel's sternest command without ever undermining it. Together they established 647 in the heart of Kazanchis, the home completed not by stone, but by her arrival. The house became a fortress and a cradle. Inside those walls, the colonel's routine was absolute. Every morning, before the city had stirred, he rose. He polished his shoes until they reflected the morning stars. He dusted his library. He marked his calendar with the precision of a military campaign. But this discipline was not for the sake of vanity. It was an act of prayer. He believed that how a man tends to his shoes is how he will tend to his country.
I was raised in Kazanchis, in the house of the colonel, where the shoes were polished like mirrors and the books were dusted like icons. I was raised in 647, where the calendar was marked with the rhythm of prayer and the stern geography of duty. I was raised where the bread was earned with honesty and shared with the stranger. I was raised in the fortress of the righteous.
The true test of a man's honor comes not when he is praised, but when he is punished for doing what is right. There is a story of the colonel's mercy that remains a splinter in the heart of the corrupt, a justice that transcends the books of men. When the state treasury groaned and failed to release salaries, leaving his officers with empty pockets on the eve of a holy holiday, Teferidin waited not for the bureaucracy to breathe. He signed his own name upon the slip and paid his men from the vault, not to steal, but to serve. He knew the risk. To the bean counters of the administration, this was an unauthorized withdrawal. To the colonel, it was a moral necessity. For this crime of compassion, the state, which often punishes the light, imprisoned him for 2 years. He complained not, but walked into his cell with the same dignity with which he walked into ballrooms. Those who visited his cell found no broken prisoner, but an unbowed king. He never begged for the sun, but remained a free, proud man in his cell. When a superior, a man of lesser spirit, bloated with petty power, demanded an apology under the threat of stripping his rank, the colonel looked him in the eye and spoke the words that would become family gospel. His Imperial Majesty gave me my epaulet. Only His Imperial Majesty may take it. They could cage the lion, but they could not silence the roar. Upon his release, still seeking to break his spirit, they reassigned him to the harshest post in the empire, the Ogaden border, where at the very least the heat would punish him. But wherever Teferidin stood, the ground became holy. In the burning sun of the border, where the dust chokes the breath and the horizon never ends, the colonel turned chaos into order. The local Dejazmash was so impressed by his paperwork and his unshakable calm that he promoted him from frontier patrol to city command. The people called him Dekeri. And there, in the crucible of exile, Woseni bore him the children who would become the pillars of the house: Tigist, Frehiwat, Wend Wosen, and Tewodros. Every birth a defiant anthem against the loneliness of the frontier. The colonel was a man who won medals for forensic science and marksmanship in the United States, yet he treated them as vanity. He carried his honors in his pocket, not on his chest. It was during his training abroad that a telegram reached him, a piece of paper that weighed more than a mountain. It told him his newborn daughter had died. He had heard of her birth across the ocean, and before he could ever cradle her, he heard of her burial. He screamed not, neither did he weep for the world to see. He simply folded the message into his Bible. He understood the terrible irony of a life that gives with one hand and reaps with the other. One can be a master of forensic science and yet be powerless before the mystery of a child's passing. When he returned, he rose to the rank of full colonel, overseeing bureaus in Bonga, Harar, and the prison administration of Shiwa, his honor remaining a shield. In Bonga, when peasants brought sheep and beer as tribute to their new sheriff, he jailed them for the insult of a bribe. When the governor pleaded that it was merely custom, the colonel forced the governor himself to take the gifts, laughing with a mirth that was as sharp as a blade. To the end of his days, he never took what was not earned. He just would not have the smell of bribery in his nostrils. Never, ever. In Harar, he was the guardian of the Lion of Judah. Once, when the emperor vanished into the hills at dawn, the colonel scoured the valleys in a fever of duty. He found him eventually, not in a throne room, but surrounded by beggars, his hands extended in blessing. Only then did Teferidin exhale. He always knew that true greatness is never distant from the people, but found in the dust with them. That the greatest power is the power that can walk among the lowest without losing its light. And he felt proud and honored then to serve his holy nation under the greatest throne. Then came the darkness. The Derg overthrew the longest continued monarch known to man and established a socialist rule, eventually consuming Ethiopia in turmoil and the streets of Addis Ababa with the Red Terror. They tried to co-opt the colonel too. The soldiers of Harar who adored him voted unanimously to send him to the Central Committee, but Teferidin refused politics in a regime of blood. He gathered his troops and pleaded with them. Vote for someone who loves the position. I cannot serve where conscience is absent. The junta was so confused by a man who refused power that they simply moved him back to Addis, giving him a modest government house, 647 in the heart of Kazanchis. The transfer was not merely a change of address, though. It was the establishment of a sovereign state of the spirit in the center of Kazanchis. When the colonel first arrived from Harar, he was met by Shambel Basha, a man of years and wisdom who received him with the formal grace of old Ethiopia. Shambel Basha recognized the arrival of a king in civilian clothes and understood that a man of Teferidin's stature did not just move into a neighborhood, he became its foundation. Mercy in Asmara. Let us travel north to the streets of Asmara to see the colonel at his most divine. It was there, amidst the tension of a city on edge, that an assassin came for him. A man sent to extinguish a light he did not understand. In a moment of high drama that would have broken a lesser man, the colonel disarmed his would-be killer. He held his life in his hands, yet did not see an enemy. He saw a victim of the era's madness. He took the weapon, not to use it, but to bury the violence. He called not the guards, nor did he break his bones. Rather, in an act of radical grace that remains a legend in the hearts of all, he sat him down. He spoke to him of honor, of the sanctity of life, and of the futility of blood. Then, he escorted the assassin to the edge of safety and helped him escape. He knew that to kill the man was to succumb to the very madness he resisted. He chose to save a life that was meant to take his own, proving that his law was a law of life, even in the shadow of death.
Language of the Cradle.
Within the walls of 647, a secret language was born, not of the academy, but of the cradle. It was a house where the infants were the ultimate naming authorities, baptizing their guardians with the music of their own tongues. It was Nahom who, as an infant, looked upon his aunt and saw a caregiver, a mother, a friend, and uttered the name Eyaya. That name, born of a baby's breath, became her identity forever. All the names that echoed through the compound, Inu, Iwe, Inanaye, Nanusha, Yo-Yo, were the holy products of babies' tongues, sounds smoothed by the softness of a child's palate, until they became the only names that mattered. In the house of the colonel, the children did not merely inherit names, they created them. They named their guardians, and in doing so, they claimed them. This was the Babel of the righteous, a linguistic sanctuary where the harshness of the military world was softened by the mewolbia and metragia of a child's love. In the colonel's home, power was stripped of its titles. The officer was a father, the judge's daughter was a mother, and the ancestors were present in every syllable uttered by a child. There, in 647, the colonel and Wasini walked side by side in a silence that was more profound than any speech. For 47 years, no neighbor or kin ever saw them quarrel. Not once. Their home was a school without walls, a republic of the heart. And Nahom grew at his grandfather's knee, watching him polish the pistol he never drew except to protect the sanctity of life. The colonel's words were the nails that held the house together. The scariest things in life are not fire or beasts. They are debts unpaid, trust betrayed, and honor lost. He raised 12 children in this manner. He saw in them the unity through diversity that the emperor highly valued. He taught them that being royal was not about blood, but about endurance. Not about the gold on one's wrist, but the iron in one's character. The atmosphere of 647 was a sensory tapestry that defied the gray standardization of the Derg era. In one room, the Buna bubbled in the Jabina, its earthy incense acting as a shroud for the heavy secrets whispered in the hallways. In another, philosophy clashed with politics like the meeting of ancient shields. It was a common saying among visitors that to enter 647 was to enter a linguistic laboratory. You could hear 7 languages at once, each wrapped in the protective velvet of laughter. The house was not just a home. It was a sanctuary of sovereignty. While the world outside was being reorganized into collectives and Kebel Ace, the colonel maintained a household that operated on the ancient laws of hospitality. He was the guardian of the imperial oath, a promise he had made to the crown and the country that he refused to let the revolution dissolve. He would tell his children stories of his life. He would discuss with his comrades how a man's uniform was a symbol of his internal discipline. "The uniform does not make the man," he would say, his voice like the low rumble of distant thunder. "The man makes the uniform. If you are hollow inside, the gold on your shoulder is just a weight for your burial."
Parliament of the Heart.
647. The marvel of intimacy that stood like a grand memory refusing to fade was a universe where each room held its own season. Raised in the time of the emperor by Fitarari Desalin for his daughter, it was a palace of mud and timber that held the dignity of a castle. Through the tides of empire and revolution, there was a time when the house seemed to host the entire nation. Over 100 names were once written in the city records as its residents. The door was never locked. It was an embassy of humanity where gathered many great souls. There was Shambel Johannes Araya, descendant of the hero Bele Zelek; Zalalim, son of Shaleka Tesema, from the Ministry of Education; Mengesha Ashbir from the Ministry of Agriculture, whose laughter was a dawn chorus that shook the window frames; and Ashanafi Haile from the Ministry of Health, who played the kirar. There was Danny Cobra from Oxford, Joni Timo, descendant of an emperor, and the many Solomons,
as if the wise king himself favored the threshold of 647. There were the Mesmur and Gide brothers, Masrisha, Jara, and the children of nobles like Lij Michael Imru and Ken Azmak Sif Selassie Abawuloze Behir Bulga. The table was a map of Ethiopia, where Oromo and Amhara, Guragi and Harari, Christian and Muslim, all ate from the same plate. The colonel's law was absolute. Every guest must eat before they speak of their troubles. "Empty stomachs," he said, "make cruel tongues." On Sundays, the compound became a village, the air vibrating with jazz and church choirs, while the colonel told stories like the time he found the emperor walking among beggars in Harar, and the room fell into a silence so deep one could hear the heartbeat of the city. "Greatness," he would conclude, "is the shortest distance between you and the smallest person." This sacred home, in the heart of hearts, was a crossroads for the nation. It was a place where the air was thick with the scent of buna bubbling in the kitchen, and the sharp intellectual ozone of philosophy clashing with politics in the parlor. It was an academy where the most advanced conversations humanity has ever had took place. The Oath and the Rebuke. The colonel's life was anchored by the imperial oath. He often spoke of the day he stood before Haile Selassie I and swore his soul to the country. To him, an oath was not a piece of paper. It was a physical weight. He told his children that once a man gives his word, he no longer owns his life. The word owns him. His integrity was a physical force. His honor, a fire that consumed all deceit. Once, when Wasini was pregnant with Iyaya, strangers came bearing an envelope of cash and a sheep, seeking the colonel's favor. She, in her innocence, accepted the gifts to deliver his greetings. But when Teferidin returned and saw the sheep tied in his yard and the envelope on his table,
his face transformed into a mask of righteous fury. To him, that sheep was not a meal. It was a tether that would bind his honor to the corrupt. He did not yell at his wife. He simply pointed to the door. "Take your sheep and your envelope and leave." Wasini, understanding her fault in the mirror of his integrity, went out into the streets with her maid, the cash, and the animal. He made her walk a public lesson that perplexed the neighborhood, made even the governor furious, and the commanders worried. But the colonel would not be moved. He despised favors with unclear intentions. He knew that a man who accepts a gift from a stranger has already sold a piece of his soul. So he made sure the neighborhood saw the return of the bribe, for he knew that the walls of 647 were held up by his reputation for being incorruptible. Had he taken that sheep, the roof would have fallen. He taught his 12 children that honesty, even in ruin, is a kind of possession.
I was raised in Kazanchis, in the house of the sheep and the envelope, where the bribe was cast into the street and the truth was kept inside the gate. I was raised in 647, where the wood was carved by the righteous and the radio sang the songs of the free. I was raised in Kazanchis, and the colonel's is memory my only inheritance. Between the Adwa of his courage and the Omedla of his return, I find my path. I am the child of Teferedegin Yitna, and my head is held high.
Now, as the mist rises from the gullies of Kazanchis, and the bells of St. Uriel ring their ancient tones, Nahum stands at the gate, the wood heavy with the fingerprints of decades. He knows the house was built twice, once of brick and once of will. And though the destroyers come to measure the land with money, they can never measure the weight of the man who lived here. He and Wasine planted the roses and the apple trees. Wendie, a man who refused to compromise with mediocrity, like a Howard Rourke of the Highlands, carved beauty out of cedar or anything, designing balconies that seemed to float on air. Tadisho studied physics by candlelight, his books weighing more than his frame. Rediot partied with and taught the youth of the neighborhood, and Chombe Eskendir was the Shekie of the alleys, fixing hearts and pipes for free, his laughter echoing through Kechenua Menged, the narrow path that he built with his own hands so the mothers of Kazanchis wouldn't ruin their clothes in the mud. When he walked through the neighborhood, the children would swarm him, calling out, "Shekie!" as a call to prayer. He, as if summoning all the world's joy, would answer, "Nerene Haya!" and they would dance around him, their bare feet drumming the earth, chanting, "Yegna betiliku anatsiv balemuya," our house's great craftsman. This was the anthem of the hands, a celebration of the man who fixed what was broken and built what was needed without asking for a single cent in return. He, like his father, refused payment, for his wealth was the breath of the community. He said, "The house of the colonel cares less for gold than the wealth in the breath of friends." He knew that in 647, the only currency that mattered was the love of one's neighbor. The Covenant of Mamila and the Neighborhood. The walls of 647 did not stop at the gate. They extended to the neighbors who were kin in all but blood. Next door lived Halu and Sagaye, his brother, with their family. They were children of Gash Tolosa. People did not merely live in Kazanchis, they breathed with her.
The Heart of Hearts was a living choir, and the colonel knew every voice. We would name everyone, for to leave a name behind would be to let a star go out. Yet we can only hope all is represented in the few mentioned, until fate names each in time. We remember Helu, whose presence was a landmark of the streets. Gash Bahiru, who lived next door to him and had coffee trees. Maheder, who married so young. Gash Mezgebe. Lij Ayatilu. Gash Belay. And the many souls who moved through the narrow path. We remember the Mamilla covenant between Chombi and Sagai, a shared name that erased the distance between friends. There was a unique and sacred bond between them that whenever they saw each other, the formal titles of the world vanished. "Mamilla," one would call, and "Mamilla," the other would answer. It was a covenant of equality and affection that defined the warmth of the neighborhood. To hear them call each other out was to hear the sound of a heart finding its home. 2 Wendwosens. There were 2 Wendwosens in the colonel's home, bound by a shared frequency of the soul. Wendwosen Tekla Birhan, son of the legendary Tekla Birhan Sersu, was a prince of paints, a man who translated the ancient spirit of Ethiopia into color and light. He carried the mantle of his father's genius, painting soul unto canvases that breathed. And Wendwosen Teferidin, the Rourke of Kazanchis, was the architect of an unyielding spirit, a creator who refused to bend his vision to the whims of mediocrity, a man devoted to his craft with such religious intensity that he would rather face the silence of starvation than the noise of compromise. He was faithful to the art of living with precision and devotion. He carved perfection, every joint and every line, a testament to a man who lived by the exact lines his father had taught him. He was gifted beyond measure, yet often starved when deserving a feast, for he would rather go hungry than compromise the integrity of his work or his word. He was ahead of his time, a visionary whose reward was more often found in the work itself rather than the coin of the realm. It was this friendship, this bridge between the artist and the architect, that brought Nesibu Sibat into the orbit of the colonel. Nesibu, the witness and chronicler of the genocidal nights Kazanchas endured then, found in 647 a sanctuary that mirrored the truths he would later pen in Fitsum Newu Enmity. The house was not just a shelter, it was an intellectual fortress where the reality of the Red Terror was met with the unwavering moral clarity of the colonel. The Red Terror and the Blood of Wareda. 15. To speak of Kazanchis in the late 70s is to speak of a ground that was permanently damp with the blood of the youth. The atrocities were not random. They were a systematic humbling of the Ethiopian spirit. 647 stood in the absolute center of the lightning. In Wareda 15, Kabela 27, the coordinates of a nightmare. Kazanchis was not just a district, she was a battlefield. She was one of the hottest spots for the struggle against the Derg. The streets had always been a thorn in the side of fascists, and now they became a thorn in the side of the military junta. The heinous atrocities committed were a black ink on the soul of the city. Massacres, inhumane slaughter, and the burial of the young. Yet, in the midst of this genocidal darkness, 647 remained a lighthouse. Kazantzis always survived her enemies and outlived their cruelty. The Red Terror was but another fascist purge, only worse, for it was brother against brother that unleashed the hell. The colonel, though a man of the uniform, was a man of the soul. He refused to let the politics of the Derg stain the sanctity of his threshold. He sheltered souls persecuted, men and women labeled enemies of the state. Among them, even a wounded member of the EPRP, whom he hid at the risk of his own life. When they transferred him to Addis Ababa as a modest relocation, to 647 in the heart of hearts, they had thought they were sidelining him. They had not realized they were placing a saint in the heart of the storm. The freedom fighter who saw the bodies piled at the intersections, the mothers of Kazantzis walking in silence, their eyes hollowed out by a grief that had no language as the Red Terror howled like a wolf at the gate, saw the colonel's law remained supreme within 647. Teferidegin was a master of the secret refuge. He was a full colonel of the old world, a figure of such gravitas that the local Kabila militias feared to knock on his door. He used his rank as a shield, standing in the doorway with a gaze that reminded the Revolutionary Guards of the exact lines they were currently crossing. He proved that even in the midst of a genocidal madness, one man of integrity can create a country of one, a sanctuary that the state cannot enter. This is the era captured with terrifying honesty by Nesibu Sabat in his book, Fitsum New Enmity. Nesibu, a first-hand witness to the atrocities, and a survivor who describes how the youth of Kazantzis fought with the ferocity of lions against the military junta, tells Kazantzis was the hottest forge of the struggle, a place where the youth faced the biggest army in Africa with nothing but their burning hearts like their patriot fathers, who defied the fascists that invaded with the biggest army to ever assault the continent.
I was raised in 647, the house of the colonel, where wickedness entered not, but only howled at the gate. Between the Red Terror's terror and the harvest of its hate, while the Wareda drank the blood of the young, and the songs of the martyrs went mostly unsung, the colonel's law was a fortress of light, a sanctuary carved from the center of night. I was raised in Kazantzis in 647, where the earth was a bed for the living, the fugitive, and the ghosts of the dead. I was raised in Kazantzis, in the parliament of the heart, where the beggar and the prince shared the same honored table. I was raised where the law of the house was mercy, and the judge was honesty. I was raised in the heart within the heart, under the man who saved lives by the sheer force of his presence, proving that one man's character can be a fortress for hundreds. I was brought up in the shadow of the colonel, who kept his uniform unsullied through terrors, red, white, and many colors. Teferidegin, who proved that a true man's will and honor can be more formidable than fires of battalions, by saving lives not by force of arms, but by the force of his soul. 647 survived because she was anchored by this man who placed righteousness above the state. She was a quiet monument to the truth that when the world goes mad, one sane house can become a nation's North Star. And I was raised in her.
The Millennium and the Last Sacrifice. By the Ethiopian millennium of 2000, the landscape of Addis was changing.
The old houses were being circled by the steel skeletons of new towers. The colonel, now in the twilight of his years, watched as the developers began to map out the district. They saw the mud and timber of 647 as a relic to be cleared. They did not see the history. They saw only prime land. But his focus was on the woman who had been his compass for more than 5 decades. They were the two halves of a single soul, and Woseni Dempsey stood by him as his body began to fail. He had lived a life of such absolute honesty that he had accumulated no wealth. There were no hidden accounts, no properties in the hills, no grease from his years in Harar, Asmara, Jijjiga, or Bonga. He was a man who had given everything to his country and his children. He had nothing left to his name but the respect of the city. The colonel was a ghost of his former strength as the end approached, yet his spirit remained a blinding light. He lay on his final bed, looking with eyes that once looked at the emperor, at Woseni, his matriarch, the daughter of the judge, the sister of a colonel, the mother of his 12 pillars, his companion of half a century. He had no money to leave her. He had no land to pass on. The state owned the house, and his pension was a pittance. He knew the struggles that would follow his departure. He signaled her to get closer, and with a trembling hand and a voice that held the final echoes of the Shinkora shepherd, he whispered, "Take these. They might help," offering his gold teeth. It was the ultimate forensic science, the reduction of a life to its final pure sacrifice. It was the last instinct of a man who gave until there was nothing left to give. It was divine devotion, a man stripping his own body of its last worldly value to ensure his queen would have one more day of security. It was the final signature on a life of total consecration. Woseni's grief was a scream that filled the halls of 647, for she knew she was losing a man the likes of which the world would never see again. She fell to the ground, broken by the sheer weight of such a love. His comrades, that knew him long, came to visit that day and stood at the feet of his bed. They saluted, and they said unto him, "So proud to live, so proud to die. Congratulations to Feridun." He passed, and the house wailed like a living creature. The city of Addis Ababa fell into a collective mourning. Neighbors filled the yard for days. The soldiers from Harar, the artists of Kazanchis, and the common men from the Bunabiets all came to salute the man they called Abuna Kazanchis. Children wept, lovers lamented, and poets brought flowers. When the last of the mourners left, his daughter sat alone beneath the apple trees he planted, and the wind from the hills of Arat Kilo carried to her the faint echo of her favorite phrase, "Hold your head high. Say you are the child of Teferet and Yitna."
I was raised in Kazanchis in 647, where the colonel's gold was the price of his grace. I was raised in the house of the 12 children, where the memory of the lion is the map of the place. I was raised where the landlord's measure is small, and the shadow of the colonel is the tallest of all. I was raised in Kazanchis, where the infants named the elders, and the gold of a man's mouth was his last gift to his wife. I was raised in 647, where the colonel polished his honor until it outshone the sun. I was raised in the kingdom of the unbending.
Monumental memory, secret inheritances. Nahum was raised in the heart of hearts, in the house of the colonel, and even after he was gone, his house refused to dim. His children carried his name like a banner, though the horizon was already crowding with the cranes of the developers, the land grabbers who saw only price where there was once only holy memory. They come with their digital maps and their cold commercial eyes, looking at 647 as prime land. They see the wood and the mud. They do not see the red terror fighters hidden in the walls. They do not see the narrow path of Chombi or the apple trees of Wasini. They do not hear the laughter of Mamilla. They do not see the two Windwosans discussing the geometry of beauty. They do not hear the call of Shekie and the thunderous joy of Nerene Haya. But Nahom carries a secret inheritance. He knows that while they can demolish the brick, they cannot evict the root. The house of the colonel was built thrice, once of timber, once of will, and once of memory. The house is eternal. It remains the last place in Addis where you can hear the echo of emperors and the laughter of ordinary men in the same breath. One day, the old man had one day whispered to Nahom, "They will measure this land with money. Remember that your worth is measured in memory." He did remember. He carries 647 within him, not as a ghost, but as a country. He is the bridge between the Aksumite stone and the Kazanchisian clay. He is the child of Teferetin Yitna, and he walks
with his head high, for he knows that he is the heir to a kingdom that no bulldozer can touch. He remembers the colonel's final lesson, that a man's worth is not measured in the land he owns, but in the honor he leaves behind.
I was raised in Kazanchis, in the heart of hearts, where the story of home is the soul's only chart. I was raised unconquerable in the house of the colonel, the unbowed, where the truth is the sun and the lie is the shroud, between the Adwa of honor and the Omedla of peace. I am the holy river whose flow will never cease.
Nahom learned to read from the colonel's reports and to think from the debates of Oxford scholars and Harar soldiers. He learned that truth is never cheap, and the measure of a man is in what he will not sell. Every corner of the colonel's compound had a guardian. There was Teowodros counting stars. There were two Windwosans discussing the geometry of beauty. There was Elisho, the scholar and philosopher. There was Sim, who came from Shim and stayed the same and knew no shame. And never forgotten is Gash Tai, the legend whom society could not evolve fast enough to appreciate. A man with ideas that sounded like echoes from a future century. Once, as he sat on the grass and saw the members of the Parliament of the Heart, he saw their fathers and the kith and kin of his grandfather. There were direct descendants of emperors and heroes, wise men and warriors. Like Nebiu Elias, for example, who was of Saint Tekel Hamanot's blood. Gash Yuhi, from the house of Belay Zalek, Johnny, heir to Johannes IV's throne. Nahom saw them all and felt the saint, the warrior, and the emperor themselves in his home. This was the secret inheritance he carried. He is the bridge between the obelisks of Axum and the narrow lanes of Kazanchis. He knows that the house of the colonel was made of an oath. And as long as these words are spoken, 647's gates remain open. This is the monument to 647. This is the chronicle of the unbound.
Kingship was bestowed upon me by the Most High God when I was born in the heart of hearts. Royalty was all we ever really had.
I was born in Kazanchis, where the earth is warm and deep, where secrets of empires in her silent valleys sleep. Between Adua's promise and Omedla's holy keep, I was born in Kazanchis, and the vow is what I'll reap. I was born in Kazanchis, in the heart within the heart, where dreams live, history judges, and royal visions start. Between the ancient longing and the future's golden chart, I was born in Kazanchis, and we'll never be apart.